History is often written in blood, and nowhere is that more true than on the battlefields of early America. We often think of the Revolution and the Civil War, but some of the most brutal and decisive conflicts happened long before, shaping the very destiny of the nation. Today we're diving into the raw, untold stories of the deadliest battles in early American military history. Conflicts that have been overshadowed by time but whose impact is still felt today. These aren't just numbers and dates. They're tales of courage, desperation, and the staggering human cost of building a country. Let's journey back to November 4th, 1791. The fledgling United States was struggling to assert its authority over the Northwest Territory, what we now know as Ohio. President George Washington, wary of the drain on the new nation's treasury, dispatched Major General Arthur St. Clair to subdue a powerful confederation of Native American tribes, including the Miami, Shawnee, and Delaware, led by the brilliant Miami chief, Little Turtle. St. Clair's army was a sorry sight. It was a mix of a few regular soldiers and a large number of poorly trained, ill-equipped militia. Many didn't even know how to properly load their muskets. They were marching deep into hostile territory, exhausted, hungry, and demoralized by the harsh autumn weather. On the banks of the Wabash River, they made a fatal mistake. They set up camp in a vulnerable position with little thought to proper defenses. No fortified walls, no reconnaissance patrols. It was an invitation to disaster. Before dawn, while the American camp was still shrouded in mist and sleep, Little Turtle and his warriors struck. The attack was swift, silent, and utterly devastating. They swarmed the militia's position first, who broke and fled in terror, running straight into the camp of the regulars, sowing chaos and confusion. The American soldiers, jolted awake by war cries and gunfire, scrambled to form lines, but it was too late. They were surrounded, caught in a deadly crossfire from warriors hidden behind trees. The scene was pure carnage. Officers desperately tried to rally their men, but they were picked off by expert marksmen. General St. Clair himself had several horses shot out from under him. The American cannons were quickly overrun and captured, turned against their former owners. For 3 agonizing hours, the battle raged. It wasn't a battle. It was a slaughter. The American soldiers, trapped and disorganized, were cut down. The retreat was even more horrific. It was a panicked, every-man-for-himself flight back through the wilderness, with warriors in hot pursuit for miles. Wounded soldiers were left behind to their fate. Of the roughly 1,400 men under St. Clair's command, nearly 1,000 were killed or wounded. The casualties were staggering: over 600 soldiers killed, along with dozens of camp followers, including women and children. In a single morning, nearly a quarter of the entire United States Army had been wiped out. This engagement, known as the Battle of the Wabash or St. Clair's defeat, remains the most lopsided defeat in the history of the U.S. Army at the hands of Native American forces. The casualty rate was almost 100% for the American side. The news sent shockwaves through the Capitol in Philadelphia. It led to the first-ever congressional investigation and forced President Washington to completely rethink his military strategy, ultimately leading to the creation of a more professional, disciplined fighting force, the Legion of the United States. But the bloodshed wasn't over. Let's fast forward a few decades to the War of 1812. Most people remember the burning of Washington or the Battle of New Orleans. But one of the most brutal and significant battles was fought on the frontier at the River Raisin in what is now Michigan. In the bitter cold of January 1813, American forces were trying to retake Detroit from the British. An American column under General James Winchester had successfully pushed a small British and Native American force out of Frenchtown, a settlement on the River Raisin. Flushed with victory, Winchester's men, mostly Kentucky volunteers, settled in. But like St. Clair before him, Winchester made a critical error. He divided his forces and failed to build adequate fortifications. He was overconfident and underestimated his enemy. That enemy was a combined British and Native American force led by Colonel Henry Proctor and the renowned Shawnee leader, Tecumseh. On the frigid morning of January 22nd, they launched a surprise attack. British cannons bombarded the exposed American positions while warriors swarmed the camp. The American regulars on the right flank were quickly overwhelmed and forced to surrender. General Winchester himself was captured early in the fighting. The Kentucky militia, however, put up a ferocious defense from behind the picket fences of the settlement. They held their ground for hours, inflicting heavy casualties on the British regulars. But with their general captured and facing overwhelming odds, they were eventually persuaded to surrender. Colonel Proctor promised that the wounded would be protected and cared for. It was a promise he would not keep. What happened next is one of the darkest chapters in American military history. Proctor, fearing a counterattack from a larger American army, hastily marched his able-bodied prisoners north toward Fort Malden, leaving the severely wounded Americans behind in Frenchtown under a small guard. The next morning, his Native American allies, enraged by their own losses and fueled by whiskey, returned to the settlement. They began systematically killing the wounded American prisoners. Those who could not walk were tomahawked in their beds. Others were dragged from houses that were then set on fire. The River Raisin Massacre became a rallying cry throughout the United States. Remember the raisin? It's echoed on battlefields for the rest of the war, inspiring a grim determination for revenge. Of the nearly 1,000 Americans who fought at Frenchtown, only a handful escaped. The rest were killed in battle, murdered in the massacre, or died in captivity. It was the deadliest single engagement for the Americans in the entire War of 1812. Now, let us turn to a conflict that is often seen as a prelude to the Civil War, the Mexican-American War. While battles like the Alamo are famous, one of the most grueling and deadly was the Battle of Molino del Rey, fought on September 8, 1847, just outside Mexico City. American forces under General Winfield Scott were closing in on the capital. Intelligence, which later proved to be faulty, suggested that a group of stone buildings known as El Molino del Reytha, King S. Mill was being used to cast cannons for the city's defense. Scott ordered an assault. He believed it would be a quick, minor operation. He was wrong. The mill was actually a massive stone fortress, part of the larger defenses of Chapultepec Castle, and it was defended by thousands of Mexico's best soldiers under General Antonio Leon at dawn. American artillery opened fire, and the infantry advanced across open ground. They were met with a murderous hail of musket and cannon fire from the fortified buildings and rooftops. The first wave of attackers was cut to pieces. Entire companies were decimated in minutes. Officers fell left and right as they tried to lead their men forward into the storm of lead. One American division, commanded by General William Worth, charged the main building. The fighting was brutal, hand-to-hand combat in narrow stone corridors and courtyards. Soldiers fought with bayonets, clubbed muskets, and fists. The objective was finally taken, but the cost was immense. Another unit, tasked with preventing Mexican reinforcements from Chapultepec, was also mauled. In just 2 hours of intense fighting, the Americans suffered nearly 800 casualties, making it one of the bloodiest battles of the entire war. For the U.S. forces, the Mexican defenders fought with incredible bravery and tenacity, inflicting a terrible toll before being forced to retreat. And the worst part, the intelligence was wrong. There was no cannon foundry. The bloody assault had been for nothing. The high casualties for such a questionable objective deeply shook the American army's morale, even as they stood on the verge of final victory. These battles, Wabash, River Raisin, and Molino del Rey, are stark reminders of the brutal reality of early American warfare. They were fought by soldiers who were often poorly equipped and led against determined foes fighting for their homes and their nations. The outcomes of these violent clashes shaped borders, forged military traditions, and left scars on the national psyche that influenced events for decades to come. They are a crucial, if grim, part of the American story, a testament to the immense sacrifice that lies at the foundation of the country. Thank you for joining us on this journey into America's forgotten battlefields. If you found this history as compelling as we do, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next deep dive into the past. Let us know in the comments which piece of hidden history you'd like us to uncover next. See you in the next video.